Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's virtual event. I'm Jeff Mahoney, General Counsel of the Council of Institutional Investors. Today, we are excited to welcome the newest chair of the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, Erica Williams. Saturday will mark 20 years since the Sarbanes-Oxley Act was signed into law, establishing the PCAOB. In the wake of the corporate financial reporting scandals of 2001 and 2002, the PCAOB was created and charged with protecting investors and supporting a sound capital market system by improving audit quality. Chair Williams was appointed by the Securities and Exchange Commission in November 2021 and sworn in on January 10th, 2022, making history as the first woman and the first person of color to lead the PCAOB. Chair Williams joined the PCAOB from Kirkland & Ellis LLP, where she was a litigation partner. Previously, she was a special assistant and associate counsel to President Barack Obama, advising the president and his senior advisors on legal and constitutional issues involving economic policy, financial regulation and reform, financial technology, trade, intellectual property, and data protection and privacy. Before that, Chair Williams spent 11 years at the SEC, serving as Deputy Chief of Staff for 3 chairs. In this role, she oversaw all aspects of the SEC's operations and served as a senior legal advisor to the SEC chair on regulatory policy and rulemakings, enforcement, compliance examinations, agency management, and strategy. A few administrative matters before we begin today's program. The program will last approximately 45 minutes and will include a question and answer session. All participants in today's program are invited to submit your questions, which can be entered anytime into the questions queue through your Zoom platform. Please be sure to include your name and affiliation with your question. Following the chair's remarks, I'll attempt to ask as many of your questions as I can in the time available. And finally, please bear in mind that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to CII's website. With those administrative matters out of the way, as we gather today to celebrate the 20th year anniversary of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, the creation of the PCAOB, and its work to protect investors, it's my honor to introduce PCAOB Chair Erica Williams. We're very excited to hear from you today and learn more about your vision for the future. Chair Williams.
Thank you, Jeff, and thanks to the Council of Institutional Investors for hosting me today. I want to start with the standard disclaimer that the views I express here are my own and are not necessarily the views of the board or the staff of the PCAOB. The work that CII does advocating on behalf of investors makes a difference. It makes a difference to your members who represent more than $25 trillion in assets under management. And most importantly, it makes a difference to Main Street investors, the retired school teachers and firefighters, and workers who have trusted their hard-earned savings to your members' judgment. People are at the heart of the mission of the PCAOB, from workers saving for retirement, to parents saving to put their kids through college, to anyone who depends on the soundness of our capital markets to invest and build their own version of the American dream. When we talk about protecting investors, this is who we mean. When we strive to uphold the highest standards in audit quality, it is with investors' families, savings, and futures in mind. Protecting investors is what prompted the creation of the PCAOB 20 years ago, and it's the mission that continues to drive us forward today. At the end of 2001, Americans were still grappling with the tragic events of September 11th and their aftermath. Our country had entered what would become the longest war in US history, and our economy was just beginning to come out of a recession. Then the Enron scandal broke. At the turn of the century, Enron was ranked 7th on the Fortune 500. Throughout the 90s, it had built a reputation as a blue chip company admired for its innovation. But that reputation was built on fraud. Enron was lying about its earnings while hiding billions of dollars in bad debt. And by the fall of 2001, it all came crashing down. After hitting a mid-2000 high of $91, Enron's share price was all but worthless by 2001. Investors lost billions of dollars in savings, 20,000 employees lost their jobs and their retirement, and trust in our markets eroded. Enron's collapse was followed by the failure of its auditor, Arthur Andersen, one of the largest audit firms in the world at the time. And Enron wasn't alone. In 2001, Enron's bankruptcy was the largest in US history. Just a few months later, it was dwarfed by the bankruptcy of WorldCom, yet another corporation caught cooking the books and leaving destruction in the wake of its scandal. So Congress took action. Led by Senator Paul Sarbanes, a Democrat from Maryland, and Representative Michael Oxley, a Republican from Ohio, both parties came together to craft legislation that passed nearly unanimously with strong bipartisan support. And 20 years ago this week, President George W. Bush signed into law the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. Among other things, the law we refer to today as SOX established the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, or the PCAOB. For the first time, investors would have an independent audit watchdog putting their interests first. The PCAOB would set clear standards to uphold the integrity of public audits, inspect for compliance with those standards, and enforce them to help restore trust in our capital markets. And since its creation, the PCAOB has registered over 3,800 audit firms, completed more than 4,300 firm inspections in 55 countries, reviewing more than 15,000 audits of public companies and over 1,000 broker-dealer engagements. We've issued more than 330 settled orders and sanctioned more than 230 firms and 270 individuals. The PCAOB audits the auditors. We don't just assume the results speak for themselves. We want to see the receipts. Multiple academic studies have found that PCAOB inspections improve audit quality both here in the US and in other countries where the PCAOB has inspection access. And evidence shows that the increase in audit quality has boosted investor confidence in the credibility of financial reporting. A study published in the Review of Financial Studies compared the market response to earnings announcements and 10-K filings before and after the PCAOB's existence. The study found both stronger stock price reactions and higher trading volume following the creation of the PCAOB, indicating investors have more confidence acting on the information they receive from financial reporting, knowing that the PCAOB is on the case. The authors of the study note, our results show that public audit oversight can enhance reporting credibility and that this credibility is priced in capital markets. Continuing to strengthen the credibility is a top priority for today's board as we carry out our mission to protect investors. And that mission is more important than ever. Today, the combined market capitalization of just 10 equity issuers is nearly equal to the total US equity market capitalization in 2002. The PCAOB's oversight helps to protect more than $40 trillion in investor exposure, and we take our job of investor protection very seriously. Reflecting on SOX 5 years after it was signed, Senator Sarbanes warned, when things get better, companies tend to forget what happened and how serious it was at the time. Trying to maintain high standards is a difficult job. Well, the PCAOB is up to the task. We understand the integrity of our capital markets is not inevitable. It takes vigilance to guard against fraud that threatens to undermine our system. We cannot forget the hard lessons learned 20 years ago. At the PCAOB, we understand exactly what's at stake, and that's what fuels our work to protect investors every day. Today's board has identified 3 key areas where we plan to further the PCAOB's investor protection mission: modernizing our standards, enhancing our inspections, and strengthening our enforcement. High standards are the foundation for high-quality audits. That's why earlier this year, the board announced one of the most ambitious standard-setting agendas in the PCAOB's history. Just 6 months into my term, we are already actively working to update more than 25 standards within 8 standard-setting projects, and we're just getting started. When the PCAOB was first getting off the ground in 2003, it adopted existing standards that had been set by the auditing profession on what was intended to be an interim basis. 20 years later, far too many of those interim standards remain unchanged. But the world has changed since 2003, and our standards must adapt to keep up with developments in auditing and the capital markets. Our current short-term and midterm projects will address more than half of the remaining interim standards from 2003. And we don't intend to stop there. We are also actively engaged with investors and investor advocates about other standard setting and rulemaking projects that we will advance. We appreciate that SEC Chair Gary Gensler has made updating these standards a priority, and I am grateful for his support of our ambitious agenda. Our standards will continue to be clear and scalable to account for differences in the complexity and sizes of audit firms and public companies and broker-dealers they audit. And our standard-setting agenda will be flexible and dynamic to meet the greatest needs. Of course, none of this can happen without input from our stakeholders, including advisory groups and the investing public. Already, we've reimagined the PCAOB's approach to meaningful stakeholder engagement. As our very first major action as a board, we established 2 new advisory groups, the Investor Advisory Group and the Standards and Emerging Issues Advisory Group. And we've elevated the voice of investors by hiring our first ever investor advocate. Inspections are one of the most important tools the PCAOB uses to protect investors. The Division of Registration and Inspections is our largest division, and inspections are our primary method of interacting with audit firms and determining whether they are complying with our standards. Each year, the PCAOB inspects approximately 250 audit firms and reviews 900 audits from across the globe. As our team likes to say, the sun never sets on PCAOB inspections. Part of how our inspections process remains effective is by remaining nimble. Our team is constantly adjusting to be responsive to new and emerging risks across the globe. For example, our inspection teams have prioritized inspections of audit engagements involving SPAC and de-SPAC transactions, cryptocurrencies, and how firms are addressing the effects of supply chain disruptions and rising costs on company operations. Enhancing our inspections also means enhancing transparency. We will continue our efforts to increase the information contained in our inspection reports and share the reports with investors in a timely manner. We will also continue to publish information to help firms proactively improve audit quality, including areas where we see common deficiencies, as well as good practices to avoid them. We expect firms to take meaningful action to address concerns in their quality control systems in a timely manner. And when they do not, we will act by publishing quality control criticisms that firms have not remediated to the board's satisfaction within the required time period. Over time, we've seen firms respond to our rigorous inspection process by improving their own internal quality controls, adding more layers to protect investors. And that brings me to our third key goal, enforcement. As you may know, I'm an enforcement lawyer at heart. We know our standards are only as effective as our ability to enforce them. Removing bad actors from the profession and punishing wrongdoing protects investors and promotes deterrence. We will not hesitate to hold wrongdoers accountable for breaking the rules. We're just about halfway through the first year of this new board. Already, we've more than doubled our average penalties against individuals compared to the last 5 years. This includes the largest money penalty ever imposed on an individual in a settled case. At the same time, we've increased our average penalties against firms by more than 65%. In the past 5 years, the PCAOB assessed penalties against individuals less than half the time and firms only about 86% of the time. This year, it's 100%. We're also pursuing enforcement actions involving certain types of violations for the very first time. And we're taking steps to proactively seek out wrongdoing by increasing the use of sweeps against firms where there may be a violation of our standards or rules. Those who break the rules should know that the PCAOB means business. We intend to use every tool in our enforcement toolbox and impose significant sanctions, including substantial penalties, to ensure there will be consequences for putting investors at risk. Working together, strong standards, inspections, and enforcement will reinforce each other and help keep investors protected. Of course, none of this is possible without the expertise and hard work of our PCAOB staff. I want to thank their staff for their dedication. They are the PCAOB's most valuable asset. Supporting them supports our mission. Now, I'd be remiss to close without addressing our ongoing negotiations with China. Earlier, I mentioned studies have found that the PCAOB's inspections improve audit quality, not just in the US, but around the world where we have access. The PCAOB has completed inspections in 55 countries, but China has continued to block our access. The US Congress sent a strong message with the passage of the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act. Access to US capital markets is a privilege, not a right. The PCAOB will follow US law, and the law is clear that we must have complete access to audit work papers of any firm we choose to inspect or investigate. No loopholes and no exceptions. While we will continue to work with the PRC authorities to reach an agreement that meets our mandate under US law, it's critical to remember that an agreement is just the first step. Our team must be able to go to China and test whether what's written on paper works in practice. Time is of the essence. 20 years ago, when he signed the Sarbanes-Oxley Act into law, President Bush noted that the American economy depends on fairness and honesty. For 2 decades since, the PCAOB has helped to ensure fair and honest auditing that supports sound capital markets. Today's board will build on that legacy by modernizing our standards, enhancing our inspections, and strengthening our enforcement. And we will carry out our mission to protect investors, keeping the people we serve at the heart of everything we do. Jeff, thank you again for having me. I'd love to turn the program back over to you and take your questions.
Thank you, Chair Williams, for sharing your vision with us today. For the remainder of our time, the chair has agreed to take some questions. So as a reminder, if you have a question for the chair, please type your question into the questions queue through your Zoom platform, and I'll ask the chair as many of your questions as I can in the time available. So Chair Williams, let me begin with a question of my own. You mentioned that under your leadership, the PCAOB has announced one of its most ambitious standard-setting agendas in its history. Can you tell us a little bit more about what we should expect to see from the PCAOB when it comes to standards and standard setting?
Absolutely. Thanks for the question, Jeff. As I mentioned, our standard setting agenda is one of the most ambitious in the organization's history, and it includes 8 active projects: quality control, non-compliance with laws and regulations, an update to our attestation standards, going concern, confirmations, substantive analytical procedures, fraud, and updates to our independence and ethics standards. But that really doesn't tell the whole story. Each of the projects that I just mentioned actually contain multiple individual standards that we intend to update. For example, when I mentioned the quality control project, that project alone has 11 different standards that we're considering replacing or significantly amending. And I already mentioned that we are actively addressing over half of our remaining interim standards. So that's what makes that agenda one of the most ambitious in history. I also mentioned that in June, we adopted our very first set of amendments designed to strengthen requirements that apply to audits involving multiple audit firms. As companies continue to increase their global presence, auditors, as a result, are using other auditors, which can create additional challenges for the lead auditor. And those are challenges that our updated standards seek to address. And so this is just one of the ways the world has changed since 2003. And that's why it's so important that our standards catch up. And as I've noted, we are actively engaging with investors and investor advocates about other standard setting and rulemaking projects that will advance. And we have a research agenda, which includes data technology and audit evidence projects, and that is also going to help to inform additional actions we may take in standard setting.
Chair Williams, related to the agenda, we have a question from Michael Cohn. He asks, yesterday, SEC Chair Gary Gensler suggested that the PCAOB needed to update its standards more quickly, including the auditor independence standard. What's your reaction?
Absolutely. So this new board, which has been in place for 6 months, has been working very diligently and has already, as I noted, updated a set of standards related to other auditors. And we have this ambitious agenda that we are moving forward, I believe, in a good pace. And I believe Chair Gensler's comments related to the past 20 years. But again, we are looking forward to this ambitious agenda that we've set. We agree that auditor dependence is a critical issue. It is on our standard setting agenda, as I mentioned, so we could take a look at the best way to ensure that our standards promote the highest ethical behavior and independence.
Question from Maria Murphy. How will you and the board increase trust between audit firms and the PCAOB to work together on audit quality?
That's a great question. And it really brings me to our Standards and Emerging Issues Advisory Group. So as I noted, as the first major action of this board, we reinstituted our advisory groups. One of them is the Standards and Emerging Issues Advisory Group, which has members of the firms on there, as well as investor advocates, academics, investors. And it is a way that we are obtaining information from all of those stakeholders and making sure that we consider all of those views, as well as the views that we receive from our very important investor advisory group in advancing our standards. So that's a great question, Maria. The other thing that we have also instituted is a new position, stakeholder liaison, in addition to our investor advocate, which will also allow us to obtain the views of a variety of different stakeholders, including firms, and our investor advocate is going to be focused on obtaining the very important views of investors in the investor advocacy community.
Question from Fiona Phillip. You mentioned sweeps. Could you shed some additional light on that? Are there certain areas the PCAOB is focused upon? And how are you determining whether something requires a sweep?
Sure. So as I mentioned, we are taking proactive steps to seek out wrongdoing by increasing the use of sweeps. And what we are focused on are violations of our standards and rules. So we take all of our standards very seriously, and we want to make sure that firms and registered persons are following those rules. And as a result, we learn a lot from our inspections, but there are occasions where we need to be able to proactively seek out to determine whether firms are complying, and that's what we are using those sweeps to do.
Question from Aaron Wright. What is the PCAOB doing for diversity, equity, and inclusion? This is a huge area of focus for the firms and the profession.
This is a great question. It is a huge area of focus for this board and for me personally. As the first person of color and first woman to chair the PCAOB and to be part of what is the most diverse PCAOB board in the history of the organization, I want to let everyone know that we are very focused on diversity and inclusion. One of the things that we have done is that recently we have announced scholarships for 250 students to pursue degrees in accounting through our PCAOB scholarship program. And a large majority of those scholarships do go to students who are underrepresented in the accounting profession. And those scholarships are going to make careers in auditing possible for the best and brightest students, no matter their backgrounds. We've also prioritized diversity in our hiring and in our, and we are additionally increasing the diversity and inclusion program internally for our staff through affinity groups, diversity councils, and the like. So diversity and inclusion is critical. I think it's very important for the regulators to reflect the diversity of the investors that we serve to protect, and the PCAOB, again, as the most diverse board in the history of the organization, does just that.
Question from Lynn Turner. The ACAP recommended the PCAOB undertake rulemaking addressing AQIs, audit quality indicators. But your new board left AQIs off your initial agenda. Why is that? And will you commit to adopting disclosure of AQIs?
I really appreciate this question from Lynn. Many of our stakeholders, as you note, have indicated that audit quality indicators are of great interest to them. And we are looking into options for adding a standard setting project or research project related to AQIs to our agenda. And I hope to provide an update very soon. I want to reiterate that our focus is on performance standards, such as quality control standards, and that will also directly affect the quality of work performed by the auditor, as well as the firm's quality control system. And of course, while focusing on those areas are important for the benefit of investors because they directly drive audit quality, we are, as I know, actively considering what additional information investors may need for them to be able to assess the quality of audits. So as many of you have heard me say before, and I know Lynn has heard me say, our standard setting agenda is dynamic. And as we advance these projects, we will continue to evaluate our approach, including related to audit quality indicators.
We have another question from Lynn Turner. SOX gives the PCAOB the power to deregister audit firms that fail to comply with SOX and the PCAOB rules. Yet foreign audit firms in China continue to fail to comply with US laws and regulations when performing audits of US listed companies. If you mean business, as you said, when it comes to regulation, why has the PCAOB failed to deregister even one Chinese auditor?
So as I mentioned, we are very focused right now on trying to comply with the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act. And I completely agree with Lynn that access to the US capital markets is a privilege and not a right. And what we are doing actively is trying to work with the PRC to reach an agreement that meets our mandates under the HFCAA, but we aren't going to stop there. And we will be prepared to make a determination if we are not able to inspect and investigate completely under the HFCAA, and then after making our determination under the HFCAA, then the SEC will have the opportunity to potentially delist. And that could impact nearly 200 companies. But we are taking our responsibility very seriously. And the HFCAA has finally given us, I think, a tool to bring the Chinese to the table to actually help us to try to potentially reach an agreement. Whether we reach an agreement is premature right now, but we are continuing to talk to them.
As important as the work of the PCAOB is, it's not necessarily an acronym your average American investor knows. So why do you think the work of the PCAOB matters to investors? And what do you want more investors to know about the PCAOB and its work?
Sure. So the PCAOB's mission is protecting investors. And that's one thing that we very much want investors to know about us. And it's okay that the average investor doesn't spend much time thinking about the PCAOB, because we spend time thinking about them and their families and their retirements and investments. And when you cut through all the technical jargon and legal terms, the heart of what the PCAOB does is to protect people. We protect their investments, their dreams, their futures. And if there's one thing I guess I want people to know about the PCAOB, it's that we have an amazing staff. They're knowledgeable, they're dedicated to the mission, and they're working hard every day to protect investors. And I'm very proud of the work that they do, and I'm very proud to be able to work with them.
As we look back on the last 20 years of the PCAOB, you spoke about a legacy of protecting investors and restoring trust and confidence following the auditing scandals of the early 2000s. What do you hope will be the PCAOB's legacy for the next 20 years?
Sure. So the PCAOB's core mission is the same today as it was when we were created, protecting investors. And confidence in the markets is stronger today than when the PCAOB was created. And I guess, what we want is for that to continue to increase in the years to come. But we know that market integrity doesn't happen on its own. And we at the PCAOB are working actively to maintain it through our standards, our inspections, and our enforcement work. And of course, the risks of change, and the PCAOB is adapting all the time to stay ahead of emerging threats. But again, our core mission of investor protection never wavers.
As we mark this historic anniversary, it feels important to talk about the historic nature of your leadership. You are not only the first woman of color, but also the first woman to chair the PCAOB. Can you share with us what that has meant to you and what message you hope it sends?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'm not the only one making history at the PCAOB. As I've mentioned, our entire board is the most diverse PCAOB board in the history of the organization. And I'm just really proud to be part of it. I think the people who are most proud of my new role are my parents, Alfred and Hattie Williams, who are both retired public servants. If you met my mother, she would not hesitate to tell you about her daughter's new job. But throughout my career, I have too often been the only Black person in the room, or the only woman, or both. And that's whether it was the classroom or the courtroom or the boardroom. And while I am truly honored to be the first, it's more important to me to make sure that I'm not the last. And that's, again, one of the reasons that I'm really proud of the PCAOB scholarship program, which is funded by the penalties that we receive in enforcement matters. I'm really proud of the fact that we've just awarded 250 students scholarships to pursue degrees, and the fact that those recipients are such a diverse group.
We have a question from Bo Delvey, and he asks, what are your thoughts on ESG policies at present and what's coming ahead in terms of regulatory compliance. And he also asked what's your opinion on scope 3 emissions. This is outside the scope of the PCAOB's work. But can you talk a little bit about what's on the PCAOB's agenda that may relate to ESG policies, including climate risk disclosures?
Sure. So we are continuing to monitor the feedback that's received on the SEC's proposed rule related to climate. And we are evaluating if there is anything that the PCAOB needs to take into consideration in the future as the SEC's climate disclosure project progresses and as accounting standards evolve. So right now, that's what we are doing, is really monitoring the SEC's proposed rule, and also keeping in mind as to whether or not there is anything that we need to do as a result of how that rule progresses.
So seeing no more questions, I'd just like to say on behalf of the Council of Institutional Investors, I want to thank Public Company Accounting Oversight Board Chair Erica Williams for taking the time to speak with us today. If you missed any portion of this program, it was recorded and will be archived to CII's website. If you have any comments or questions regarding this program or CII's views on any of the issues discussed, please feel free to contact me at Jeff, Jeff, at CII.org. That concludes today's program. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Jeff.